This is a review of the 1943 Mark Sandrich film So Proudly We Hail, which stars Claudette Colbert, Paulette Godard, and Veronica Lake. It's rated 7.5 on IMDb with 1,600 votes, which is really not that many. This movie really surprised me. Not at all what I was expecting, and is actually, I think, pretty great for a couple of different reasons. It's about nurses serving with the United States military in World War II in the Philippines, Corregidor and Bataan specifically. And immediately, when you hear that, there are a couple of concerns. There are a couple of immediate red flags you worry about with this movie. The first one, of course, is you worry how this movie from 1943 is going to portray the local Filipinos. And if there's any chance whatsoever that it's not just going to be sort of a pathetically stereotypical and racist even portrayals of the local people. That was definitely on my mind when I started watching it. And it actually takes quite a while in the movie to meet any Filipinos. And for the most part, you don't really see many at all. Is the portrayal particularly realistic? I don't think so. Obviously, I don't think any of the actors are Filipino, but of course, the Philippines was, when this movie was made, the Philippines was controlled, was still in conflict where the U.S. had basically lost footing. So it wasn't filmed on location, obviously, and I don't think it was filmed with any Filipino actors. But like I said, the role of the local people is very minimal, actually. And since the U.S. was fighting on the side of the Philippines, even if it's a super oversimplified portrayal of some of the people, at least they are the good guys. And there are maybe three different, there's a couple of different characters who are actually Filipino. One of them is the doctor, is a doctor in the movie, and he is a really sympathetic character and intelligent, knows what he's doing, refined, good surgeon, things like that. There's also some sort of assistant person who falls into a similar sort of category, and then there are a couple of soldiers who are portrayed as being pretty simple, and then there are patients that are just sort of neutral. For the most part, my fears that the movie was just going to be impossible to watch because of this, it turns out to be all right. It's not really a main focus of the movie. It's mostly about Americans, and it mostly shows Americans. So that's, the movie just barely scrapes by with being watchable in that regard, at least for me. Another thing that immediately you think, this is going to sort of wreck the movie, is that this is a movie made during World War II about the war, so surely it's going to be a pro-war movie, or a movie that justifies the conflict, or a movie that has a simple, hugely oversimplified view of national politics and conflict and whatnot. And that is somewhat true, but the movie ends up being a lot more complicated than I had expected, and a lot different than I would have expected. So I will go into this more. The movie depicts events that took place in 1942 in real life, and the movie came out in 1943. So from a historical accuracy point of view, while there are some simplifications, it more or less seems to check out. It seems like they get sort of the locations and the names and the dates right. But of course, the events had happened last year. And actually, it's kind of remarkable that they were able to make the movie so quickly, especially given some of the things that I'll get to later on with some of the special effects and whatnot. It's remarkable that they could make it in such a short turnaround. There's a lot of movies made during the war are complicated and fascinating, and this one, particularly because it's about women, is, I think, there's another layer of complexity there, and it actually, in my opinion, ends up being a pretty cool take on the situation in some ways, but there are some complexities there, and this is definitely an old movie. But let's start at the beginning, I guess. Most of the movie is told in flashback, and the very beginning is the present day with the nurses coming back from the Philippines, landing in Australia, whatever. We'll skip that part. The movie really starts with the nurses boarding a ship to sail to the Philippines. I think they start out in Hawaii and they go to the Philippines, and this is around the time it seems like it's around the time of Pearl Harbor that they're on the boat, and it's really unclear what the heck's going on. But at this point, the movie is really not a war movie at all. What it really is sort of a catty, like, women's picture, like you might see in the 30s with the movies The Women or Stage Door, two examples. That's sort of an entire genre on its own of movies mostly about women with lots of cattiness and lots of sort of drama and conflict and whatnot. Although I will say, Stage Door, I think, is a great movie. And I think that I like The Women, although I honestly can't remember the movie at all. But Stage Door is really cool. I think it's a great movie. This movie starts out like that. So it's not a war movie at all, really, except that it happens to be on a Navy ship. It is a movie about women and soldiers playing card games, falling in love after about knowing each other for about 2 minutes, as one does in a movie from the 40s, meeting each other, gossip, lots of gossip and cattiness and whatnot. And that's kind of odd. That was not what I was really expecting, but it sort of makes sense given the era. There's also a couple of interesting things that happen on the boat. For instance, they celebrate Christmas while on this ship. And there's a really interesting sort of sermon given by the priest or a chaplain who happens to be on the ship to celebrate Christmas, where he talks about how sentimentality is actually a strength of America and whatnot, and how maybe our enemies will slam us for being sentimental, but actually it's one of the things that makes the country great. This is part of the movie being World War II propaganda, because that kind of reasoning about celebrating sentimentality in the United States is really just sort of a backhanded way of dehumanizing the Japanese, who are being portrayed as inhuman, robotic, unfeeling, right? Which is a big theme throughout lots of media produced about World War II, and even contemporary documentaries, even stuff made now, will sort of invoke this sort of unfeeling, robotic, just following Hirohito idea. And I think that the legacy of that idea of Asians as unfeeling, that's still sort of ingrained in the culture here to some extent, which is unfortunate. This movie totally buys into that throughout. If you're looking for any kind of complexity whatsoever regarding the Japanese, you will not find it in this movie at all. That said, there is some really interesting complexity that we'll get to, but I'll make that absolutely clear. This movie is completely bought in on the Japanese being bad and inhuman throughout the entire movie, and perhaps to a degree that might not even be factual, although I don't know enough about the fighting in the Philippines to really know, but it's pretty extreme in that regard. It starts out fairly subtly, though, with this Christmas sermon talking about how Americans are great because we're sentimental. And this part of the movie is hugely sentimental. In some ways, it almost reminds me a little bit of From Here to Eternity, which, of course, was made much later. But that's a movie about soldiers before Pearl Harbor in Japan. And there's this sort of looming specter of maybe some sort of conflict or maybe something happening. It's funny because From Here to Eternity is, just for a minor tangent, is maybe one of the most misremembered movies of all time, I think, because many people think of it as a romance. They think From Here to Eternity means something about how long you'll love someone for, and whatnot. But if you watch the actual movie, it's not really a super romantic movie, besides a couple of scenes or a couple of plot lines. It's more a movie about ennui and about waiting for things to happen. And From Here to Eternity, I think the title has more to do with this sense of foreboding and ennui and this listlessness before the storm. This movie, when they're on the ship, has a bit of that. It's the very sentimental, but for the most part, it's a portable America. They've brought along the apple pie and whatnot. There's all these good boys from home who are, know each other from the football games and whatnot, and are recounting old football memories and such. And, of course, there's couple formation. So the various nurses meet people. Now, Veronica Lake's character is introduced at one point in this. Olivia is her name. And so Claudette Colbert in this movie, you can probably understand. If you know anything about Claudette Colbert, you can imagine how she would be a good nurse in a movie, how she could portray one. Has a sort of very kind of maternal-esque sense in some ways. It's sort of innocent and pure and maternal to some degree. Veronica Lake is a bit different. And in this movie, she's had much more of a prickly character, as would really fit sort of the other roles she played and the things that she was known for. Okay, so we spend almost 45 minutes on the boat. And at this point, I'm thinking, is there going to be, what is this movie? Is there any war in it? Is this just going to be sort of sentimentalism? But they do show up in the Philippines eventually, and set up shop and start nursing and treating people. And this is when we enter sort of the MASH-like portion of the movie, which is what most of the rest of the movie is, where they're actually on the ground and treating people. This is when you meet the first sort of Filipino people. Like I said, I already sort of went into the couple different categories of character that play minor roles in this movie. And pretty soon, the movie really goes through an inflection point and shifts entirely away from this sort of catty women's picture of the 30s to something much more intense. And overall, I would say this movie is an order of magnitude more intense than I could have even imagined. For 1943, this movie is remarkably intense. The way its depiction of war is in some ways leaning on some of the greatest hits of war movies, books, some of the archetypes of it, some of the things that happen you will see in other movies too, but they are much more compelling than I had expected. And this movie in general is much more compelling than I had expected. Given how it starts off, I did not picture myself getting emotionally invested in the movie at all. The relationships that form between some of the nurses and soldiers, they form so quickly that you think, this is kind of ridiculous. I don't think I'm going to be particularly invested in this. But by the end of the movie, they actually start to ring really true, at least for me. There is, I think, a bit of an exorcism, really, of the women's picture that happens in this movie. Interesting story about Veronica Lake. So she was known earlier in her career for an iconic hairdo. She had really long hair that was mostly swept all the way to one side. Well, when World War II was underway, she started doing her hair up, and then eventually she cut her hair. She changed her hairstyle. It was famous. It was in all the newspapers, partly because the U.S. propaganda machine for the war wanted everyone to see that she had a different hairdo. Why is that? Well, because more and more women were working in factories, and long hair was a risk when you were working near a bunch of machines that could snag your hair and pull your head into some sort of assembly line. So she changed her hairdo in this symbolic endorsement of women in the workplace. There was a huge shift in terms of media let me just say this. This movie totally embodies this shift from women in women's pictures in the 30s, right? Stage doors from 1939 to late 30s that these sort of movies were being made, to World War II era when women are in the factories. And it's like suddenly we slam the brakes on all of the American propaganda saying, here's you women, you should spend most of your time in, hairdressers, gossiping with other women and going to buy expensive clothing and whatnot. And slam the brakes on that sort of American national propaganda and tweak it. Okay, actually, we need you in the factories. Everyone, short hair. Here's what we do. So this movie, a big part of why this movie is interesting and cool is because it goes in on that idea. And what that really means is that the women in the movie are remarkably strong and compelling characters because they are shown as really brave, strong, proud nurses on the front lines, which is really cool. And I didn't really expect the degree to which they would be celebrated as heroines in this movie. So that's really interesting. Like I said, the movie is several orders of magnitude more intense than I had expected. And so the war really is shown in a frightening manner, which is, again, not at all what I had expected. And this is the part of the movie where some of these relationships that, like I said, they start off pretty shakily. You think, there's no way I'm going to become emotionally invested in that. They actually start to ring true once you get the intensity of the war. And once you start to see the women as more compelling characters who are actually taking matters into their own hand, who are actually strong characters fighting in this war, suddenly the movie the pieces really start to come together much more. Also, the production value of the movie starts really elevating at this point. A lot of the scenes in the war are really surprisingly elaborate and whatnot. Some of the attacks, some of the bombings from the Japanese, which I will say, I'm not sure if that's factual, but could be. But some of the bombings from the Japanese, some of the attacks and whatnot, are shown with sort of spectacularly large sets, huge, intricate productions and whatnot. Very intense. Startlingly intense. This is, like I said, when the movie really starts to come together. And here's another thing that's fundamentally just sort of interesting about the movie is that the movie is made during World War II, so it is propaganda for the U.S. military and for America. At the same time, the war that is depicting, or the specific sector of World War II that it's depicting, is the U.S. in the Philippines, which was basically a disaster. And that puts a really interesting spin on things, because you are expecting this to be a patriotic sort of rah movie, except that the events that it is depicting were basically a failure, went really poorly and whatnot. And that starts to be one of the defining sort of tensions of the second half and the last third of the movie, because as you see all this intense fighting and whatnot, it is not triumphant. This movie is tragic. It's really quite sad. The U.S. do quite poorly. The nurses are ragged, run ragged and whatnot, and start being struck by just sort of tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And you start wondering, I guess this is a pro-war movie. Now, for the most part, the movie, this is where things start to get a bit interesting, where you have to think about some of the logic that's going on with the production. Because for the most part, like I said, the movie is made to, the movie is made as a propaganda film. There's not a lot they can get away with in terms of the tragedy. So how are they going to make, how do they answer this question of, we're failing in the Philippines, but we want to show the U.S. as great and this war is just? Well, one strategy they could use a fair amount is blaming the Japanese, right? This makes sense. This is a way out of this problem where you say, okay, well, actually, we are great and whatnot, but the Japanese are just taking it a step too far. They're just, doing things that are so inhumane and so horrible that there's nothing we can do. Even the great America will fall to that and whatnot. And the movie goes that way a little bit. Another strategy that the movie also uses is to claim that there actually is some sort of victory in it. And I will say that in the Philippines, the Japanese were never totally successful at conquering the Philippines, mainly because there's a gazillion islands in the Philippines, and there was a lot of resistance from Filipinos and whatnot. And so the movie at a couple of times tries to make some sort of claim that America has instilled this lust for democracy in the Filipinos and whatnot, and that is actually a victory. So even though we're retreating, we actually won because we converted the locals or something like that. The movie goes that way a little bit, which is sort of debatable if that's true at all. But almost astoundingly, the movie also takes a third approach a couple of times, and it criticizes the war, which blew my mind. There is a scene where Claudette Colbert is the nurses. This is once they are in Corregidor. The nurses ask Claudette Colbert, who's a bit of a leader among the nurses, why there aren't reinforcements, why nothing has happened. And she suggests it's because the U.S. has overextended itself. It's because we think that the whole world is America, when really it isn't. And countries like this are actually just American graveyards. And at this point, my jaw is like hanging down. My mind is blown. What the hell is going on here? This is supposed to be a propaganda movie where Claudette Colbert is criticizing U.S. imperialism and expansion across the world. Lunacy. Like, what's happening? And this is the point where it's like, wow, this is really quite an interesting and unexpected movie. Now, that scene is later walked back a little bit. There's in the next day or something, another nurse is behaving a bit erratically, and she goes and she apologizes to Claudette Colbert, the head nurse, or one of the higher up nurses, and says, sorry, I needed to blow off some steam. It won't happen again. And Claudette Colbert says something along the lines of, oh, don't worry, what do you think I was doing yesterday when I was running my mouth, right? And so they sort of account for it like that. But the thing that's really interesting with this is that you can see exactly the tightrope that the producers are walking here between making a propaganda film and making an actual movie about the conflict in the Philippines and how poorly things went, and the astounding costs for women on the front lines and whatnot. And they actually do a lot more than I would ever have expected. They actually put much more of a sort of a dissenting voice, much more of an intense energy around the film than I would have ever expected. So, like I said, a really, really surprising movie, and a movie that is in many ways marked by these sort of fine balances that the producers, directors, writers, everyone making the film is trying to strike at this time. I think there's also some extent to which maybe one of the reasons why the movie ends up being so sort of intense and so heartfelt in a way is that the U.S. really was in a war, at that time. And maybe that's one of the things that just shows through is the real wariness and aggravations and fear and emotions of people in the United States during World War II. I think there's a distinct possibility that is really what is at the core, that the real anxieties and the real emotions of people in the U.S. making the movie are kind of at the core of this movie, which is pretty cool. So like I said, when you start watching this movie, it seems like a bit of a mess. The tagline of this movie is something along the lines of the first great love story of women at the front or something, which just sounds like, what the hell is this going to be? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. How are they going to bring these things together? It starts off as like a super catty, like women's picture, not even like, not a war movie at all. Then you realize, oh, we're getting a bit of a before and after here. They're exorcising that thing. And then once you're sort of an hour into the movie, you really are, I was at least, really just continually surprised by how intense, how interesting the movie was. And like I said, everything sort of began to ring true. I became much more emotionally invested in the relationships than I had ever expected. And by the end of the movie, yeah, I mean, I was totally in it. I will say the very end of the movie is kind of stupid. At the last second, they do kind of try and bring it back around to the optimism side of things, using one of the strategies I mentioned before. And it's a bit of an eye roll sort of moment. Like I said, this movie is walking an interesting tightrope, and you can really see, as you're watching, you can really see the places where they start to lean over a bit more to one side and where then they lean back and whatnot. And it is extremely interesting to see how that works out. A few other just sort of interesting notes. Like I said, the special effects in this movie are astoundingly good. They really capture some of the intensity of the battle in a way that I was totally surprised by, especially for a movie that I'd never heard of and that hasn't really gone on to do much, that it's not super famous now. It was surprising to me that this movie is not better known just for the sort of scale of the production. And like I said, they made this movie in a year, or less even, which is, again, it's quite impressive. And again, shows the partly how much strategic importance Hollywood and producing a certain sort of media during the war was, but also how potentially committed the filmmakers actually were towards doing something that they felt fitted the war effort to some extent. So, right, the actual production, the music in this movie, I thought was way better than I had expected. A lot of movies from the 40s have way over the top music that is just sort of laughable these days. I found the music in this to actually do a really good job at setting the mood and whatnot, not being overly dramatic, but being there, fairly big presence, and yeah, surprisingly good score. A lot of these 40s movies, the score doesn't really even, it's really in your face, but it's not something you would ever remember after the fact. It's just sort of another 40s score. But this movie, the music is pretty good. Like I said, acting is the final thing. Acting, again, pretty good. Claudette Colbert, pretty good. Veronica Lake has one scene that's a bit weak, but otherwise really strong. Paula Goddard, also pretty good. So overall, great production. This movie is not like some light years ahead of its time, deep, insightful movie. It's not an anti-war movie. It is not an anti-propaganda movie. It is a movie made, during World War II by the United States. It is propaganda, but like I said, it is more complicated and way more interesting than I had expected. And I think totally worth watching. So this is So Proudly We Hail, directed by Mark Sandrich from 1943, a really interesting and surprisingly compelling movie with anachronisms, without a doubt, but that I had a good time watching, that is compelling and really interesting. So I would suggest it if you want a cool war movie and an interesting take on the women's picture from 1943.